what's always been really fascinating to me? Death. No, seriously, as a subject, death is pretty cool. My morbid curiosity was piqued at a young age by a violent tragedy in the family, leaving me with a deep love for the macabre in the form of murder mysteries, procedural dramas, and straight-up true crime. In high school, I devoured media like CSI and Sherlock Holmes. Wait, no, not the Neil Blanderdash version, get him off my screen. And to this day, I still can't pull myself away from a good whodunit. So naturally, when my girlfriend brought up a new walking simulator about a girl looking into the tragic and sometimes mysterious deaths of her family members, I was quick to let it sit in my Steam library for over a year, giving everyone else all the time in the world to say anything original I might have been able to contribute to the conversation until I booted it up out of boredom one day. My girlfriend even told me that this would be good video material, so I'm dedicating this one to her for knowing me better than I know myself, and introducing me to one of the best games I've played in a long time. What Remains of Edith Finch. Hopefully I'm not just repeating what others have already theorized. Before I go any further, I do feel the need to forewarn you that I'm going to be delving into some unpleasant subjects such as child abuse, child death, domestic violence, and suicide. I try to handle these subjects with as much delicacy as I can, but those who are particularly sensitive to any of these areas should probably click away now. Also, major spoiler warnings for the entirety of the game. If you haven't played it yet, I can't recommend this title strongly enough. As I previously mentioned, What Remains of Edith Finch is a 2017 mystery adventure walking simulator developed by Giant Sparrow. It follows the titular Edith as she retraces her ill-fated family's steps inside her childhood home. As you proceed, you experience the deaths of her ancestors either through their own eyes or a retelling in the form of a letter or news article. Most of these deaths can be taken at face value. In chronological order, Odin went down with the houseboat, Calvin flew off his swing set onto the rocks below, Sven fell off the slide he was building, Gregory drowned in the bathtub, Gus was struck by debris during a storm, Sam was tossed over the side of a cliff, Walter was struck by a train, Edie most likely died by combining alcohol with her medication, and Dawn died of a prolonged illness. But what of Molly, Barbara, Milton, and Lewis? The portrayals of their untimely demises leave plenty of room for interpretation, so today I'm going to be piecing together the clues to see if we can't make heads or tails of what happened to the rest of America's most unfortunate family. Let's start off in 1947 with 10-year-old Molly. After being sent to bed without any supper, Molly wakes in the middle of the night and begins to search her room for anything that seems edible. I'll be the first to admit, this one is actually pretty straightforward once you look past that bad trip of a fever dream sequence, but there seems to be a bit of confusion that needs clearing up. I've heard several Let's Players refer to the berries she consumes in the bathroom as mistletoe, which can have hallucinogenic properties when consumed, but those are in fact holly berries, which are highly toxic and should always be kept out of the reach of children. Still, I don't find it particularly odd that a little girl with an active imagination, an apparent love of nature, and a belly full of toxic ingredients would crawl back into bed, fall asleep, and proceed to have some truly hog-wild dreams. The Finch family is shown to have a penchant for the dramatic as well, so it doesn't surprise me that Molly would think to recount this tale on her deathbed. She is her mother's daughter, after all. Speaking of Edie, I find it worth mentioning that Molly seems to single out mothers on 2 occasions during the dream sequence. It's almost as though she subconsciously blames her mother for depriving her of supper, not letting her out of her room, and leaving toxic berries in her bathroom in the first place. For me, one line really punctuates the theme of parental neglect while she's in the form of a cat.
Mom and Dad didn't even look at me.
Yikes. No wonder Edie seemed to prefer to think she was eaten by a monster under the bed. Jumping forward nearly 13 years brings us to Halloween night, 1960. 16-year-old Barbara is babysitting in the Finch home with her boyfriend, Rick. This one is harder to put together, given the form it's presented in. A pulpy, Tales from the Crypt-style comic book that depicts the events leading up to her death. Everything here has to be taken with an extra coarse grain of salt, but it's worth mentioning that this is the version Edie chose to memorialize her daughter with in her personal shrine. However, I think that says more about Edie and her imagination than it does the circumstances of Barbara's death. Much like her older sister, I think it's safe to say Barbara wasn't eaten by monsters. The comic explicitly states that her boyfriend, who also vanished, was blamed for her disappearance, and given his behavior throughout the comic, I find this very believable. He's pushy, he seems more interested in Barbara the child star than Barbara the person, and is trying to worm his way into the role of her agent or manager. I do have to mention, though, that voice actor has excellent timing and is obviously having a lot of fun with the role.
Barb, have you seen my other crutch?
While I have nothing but gut feeling to back this up, I'm under the impression that the Hookman is just a red herring and likely never made a real appearance. He seems more like a loving reference to the old man-door, hand-hook car door urban legend than an actual plot point. There's nothing greater at work here. just the outlash of an overbearing, manipulative boyfriend who couldn't handle Barbara's righteous indignation over an immature prank. Perhaps the scariest thing about it is just how commonplace it is. It's another 4 decades before another truly perplexing death takes place in the Finch family. In 2003, 11-year-old Milton disappears without a trace, causing a great rift between Edie and Dawn, while Lewis retreats into himself to cope with his grief and guilt. This is easily the most confusing account in the whole game, as it consists of nothing more than a simple flip book left behind by Milton himself. In the book, he's shown painting a door, opening it, stepping over the threshold, and vanishing as it closes. This required some investigating on my part, and I soon learned that this was meant to be an Easter egg acknowledging the studio's only other game, The Unfinished Swan. This game takes place in a magic kingdom ruled by a king with an uncanny likeness to Milton. Indeed, looking around his room, you can see several references to the other game. Giant Sparrow has confirmed this theory to be true, but as much fun as I'm sure that was for the developers and those who have already played The Unfinished Swan, I felt the truth rather lackluster and found myself searching for an answer within the universe of Edith Finch. I eventually stumbled upon Knuckles Up's video on the subject, which I've linked in the upper right corner as well as in the description. I fully credit him for my current stance on what happened to Milton, which is this. Given his family's history of instability and mental illness tracing back at least as far as their great-great-grandfather, Milton is already predisposed to a variety of disorders. After his 10th birthday, he became more isolated from his family and eventually reality itself. In a sense, his art did consume him, but rather than in a literal sense, I believe it caused him to disconnect and wander off into the surrounding woods, never to return. Tragic, but far more fulfilling from a narrative perspective. Honestly, you're better off just watching his video and coming back here. He expresses the idea far more coherently than I ever could, and has even made updates and corrections. This theory on Milton's fate is heavily echoed in the events surrounding the death of his older brother Lewis, who died in 2010 at the age of 22. I could spend an absurd amount of time dissecting his death sequence in all its beautiful, powerful imagery, but as so many people have done this before me, I'm just going to stick to talking about the actual cause of death. I've heard several YouTubers whom I admire all come to very different conclusions. Some have theorized that he lost concentration during work and lost his arm in an industrial accident. Others have concluded that he purposely stuck his head into the machinery, an idea that's backed up by the imagery in his fantasy world, and others still have suggested that he simply jumped out a window at the cannery. While my personal thoughts fall more in line with the last 2 theories and that Lewis did take his own life, I still believe both of these interpretations are entirely too literal. Workplace suicides are very uncommon, and while statistics alone aren't proof enough, it seems far more likely to me that he decided to end it all in the comfort of his own home, most likely his room or bathroom. Every death in the family has been embellished in one way or another. Just as Gregory didn't turn into a frog in the bath, Lewis probably didn't chop off his own head to an audience of traumatized factory workers. Most likely, he found other means, possibly an overdose on his grandmother's medication, while surrounded by the comfort of his pot paraphernalia and the reminders of his Indian heritage that he so proudly displayed. Now, this conclusion is in no way official, but this is the most sense I can make of the 4 most mysterious deaths of the Finches, a family characterized as much by their eccentricities as they are by their personal tragedies. Hopefully, this video will have cleared up any confusion, but one thing I can say about this game is that there will always be something else worth re-examining. Until next time, keep on gaming!